Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to our discussion of the rise of entrepreneurship in India. This is part of our series on entrepreneurship in Asian high-tech industries. I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford. We're an industry-funded research center at Stanford to express thanks to all of our member companies for the financial support that allows us to put on programs like this. The list of companies was rotating around on the slide before we started, and you can also find out more information on our website. Today, for our discussion of entrepreneurship in India, I'm really delighted to welcome back a good friend and colleague, Dr. Amit Kapur. Amit is in real life the honorary chairman of the Institute for Competitiveness in India and also the president of the Indian Council on Competitiveness. But we're hosting him as a visiting scholar at Stanford, where you are virtually today. And Amit and I just taught a course last quarter together on rebalancing economic systems. That was one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences I've had in recent years. Amit has been associated with the concept of competitiveness for a long time. He's been inducted into the Competitiveness Hall of Fame, which is administered by the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness at Harvard University. He served as chairman of the Porter Prize and has worked closely with Professor Michael Porter on many projects. He's the author of several best-selling books about the India economy, one, Riding the Tiger, and another called The Awakening, which is really the history of the Indian economy since the country's independence. Amit is also credentialed in the area of entrepreneurship because he's an angel investor. He's invested in a number of Indian startups, including Metal and Solace, and Devtron Labs. And we'll ask Amit to give some kind of informal comments. This time, I think Amit will probably have 15 or 20 minutes of sort of remarks up front, and then we'll move into a Q&A format. Amit, thanks for joining us at 5 o'clock in the morning, Delhi time. We really appreciate your waking up for us.
Thank you, Richard. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here today. And thanks a lot for the kind introduction. In fact, so at least my cycle is going to get okay now, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, more in sync with the nature. So that's where it is. But as we quickly move into the conversation, I would just like to say a special hello to two of my students here, who I see, Abigail and Dale. Thanks for joining in. And so that means you survived me in the course last year. So you survived me and Richard on the course, but thanks a lot. So, but just very quickly, as we talk about entrepreneurship in India, it's a very fascinating area to really understand as to how things have been happening in India over the last few years. But we have to also understand the whole idea of how Indian economy has really moved over the last 70 odd years. Because the story of entrepreneurship is embedded within how India has actually grown over a period of time, how various set of enterprises have actually emerged over a period of time. If you really look at it, the Indian economy has had various stages in terms of like how it has actually come through, what were the policy actions, and so on and so forth. So typically, like there are 4 or 5 stages of Indian economy, and that there is a huge sync with as to how entrepreneurship has risen in India over a period of time. So you have a distinct phase between the 1950s to the 80s, the early years, when of course the Indian economy was growing at a fairly slow rate, which we used to be called as the Hindu rate of growth. But that is the point in time when it was also the time of the license Raj. That is when small enterprises were actually getting created. So you had large sets of enterprises like the Tatas, the Modis, the Ruyas or whatever, who were there, who would always have a license and then operate in a certain space. The concept of a large enterprise was that they were always going to have large set or a large number of companies or units or subsidiaries that would actually work in many sets of areas. Say at one point in time, Tata's had close to about 100 different businesses. They still continue to be very large, but they started small and then they actually moved up. And then, of course, there's a phase which happened between 1980 to 1990. That is the first time when there was a certain set of entrepreneurial energy that actually started coming up within the Indian context. And when I say the entrepreneurial energy, that was in sync with Rajiv Gandhi taking over as the prime minister, because that's a time when India said, oh, we are actually going to move up, or we are going to look at some technological solutions or situations and see what we are able to do. How we are able to take things under the sun at that point in time. That was the start of the telecom revolution of sorts. So a lot of people don't know, we have to credit the then Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, for really setting the seeds for a technological revolution that we see in the country. And then, of course, the other phase that actually did happen, which was very, very significant, was 91. That is the time when India was actually facing a balance of payment crisis. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and then, of course, the then finance minister who ended up becoming the prime minister again, that was Manmohan Singh. They actually unveiled the liberalization in India. And that's the time, for the first time, people started seeing that there is something like, oh, businesses can grow. There can be people in the stock market. There is something called the stock market. And that's when that huge visibility did happen. And so at that point in time, you did see a large set of energy coming in and the smaller set of firms becoming larger over a period of time beyond a certain size, because that was also the dismantling of the license Raj. And then, of course, there is also a phase between 98 until 2014 when system was really moving out or moving in the way it was. There was some entrepreneurial energy. There was this dot-com bubble that did happen. There were a large set of firms which actually did come up at that point in time. And you had very interesting startups that actually did come up. But I think 1998 was way too early across the world, if you really look at it. There was this whole huge dot-com bust. There were some unique ideas that were coming through, but a lot of them did not survive. You had a lot of content-based or technology-based things, but India was just not ready for it. Possibly the world was not ready for it because the penetration levels of technology or what you call as access to information was very, very low at that point in time. And one of the foremost things being the internet. Internet was just happening at that point in time. India had its first internet connections probably in 94, 95. And I still remember my first internet connection was 14.4 kbps kind of a speed. So it used to take ages for things to really come across. So if there are young people out here, they will realize they might not even understand what 14.4 kbps actually means. And we used to work on Word and everything. So that's what was happening. But then there's something very interesting that did happen post 2014. And then that was a new, what I call, view of the world that, yes, we are going to actually be something very different. There was this whole huge development agenda that was actually coming through. And that's when things started moving up in a very, very interesting pattern. And when you really talk about things moving up, of course, we've had our own sets of issues in terms of, 2016, there was demonetization, or when the currency was actually banned, or 90% of the notes were actually banned, or the high currency notes got banned. It did have an impact, positive, negative in many, many ways. Negative, of course, the circulation of money got sucked out. It had its own sets of issues in terms of how enterprises were functioning. There was a huge impact in terms of economic impact in terms of how poor were behaving or how the informal sector was there. But I think there was also a positive thing that actually did happen out of that thing. Again, the jury is out on this, but the question was that, yes, a lot of people started looking at entrepreneurship at that point in time. It did propel the entrepreneurship thing. And then at that point in time, there was also this huge energy and huge confidence that India was actually having, and that we are going to move into enterprise. Because during this period of 70 years, there's also a very interesting attitudinal change that had actually happened. The people were moving from an absolute obsession of jobs with the government to something like, yes, we can do something on our own. And why this attitudinal shift did actually happen. And the most important point in time here is the 1990s until about 2010. Because if you really look at the generation before who was there, people my father's age or probably who were just who were born at the time of independence, they were always living in a very resource scarce society. And that is a time when people were actually looking at things like jobs. And there was this absolute obsession of getting a job with a government entity and working there. But then after 1990s, the confidence did emerge, and it started spilling out in terms of saying that entrepreneurial energy, that yes, we can create our own enterprises. There was this whole huge social acceptance that was actually happening in terms of saying, oh, we can look at enterprise as an option. We can actually go out, because it was no longer a cliched thing or whatever. I would like to be an entrepreneur or whatever. People were not looking down upon you. They were starting to look up to you. Oh, yes, he is going to be a new age entrepreneur. And we were also seeing some very interesting emergence of valuations at that point in time, because people were starting to see that, okay, yes, if I am investing, there is a possibility of actually making some money out of it. I can have stability and things. So that is what was actually happening. So this whole huge attitudinal shift, and we started seeing a lot of energy post 2010 into that kind of a thing. But then, of course, as you were really looking at how things were moving, there's a very important set of thing that was happening in terms of like how India has to be looked at. Of course, like when we really talk about India in terms of where does India stack up, like whether it's an innovation-driven economy or an efficiency-driven system or a factor-driven system or a factor-driven economy. Like India traditionally was a factor-driven economy wherein you had huge sets of resources and you were just working on those resources, and resources in terms of land, labor, capital. But then if you really look at it, there were these pockets in India which was about efficiency and it was about innovation. So India has too many places or too many sets of evolutionary frames all set in one. Quite interestingly, you had Bihar as a location which was probably not doing very well, but you also had a location like, say, Delhi, Bombay, Pune, or what I call Hyderabad or Bangalore, which was really doing exceedingly well in terms of entrepreneurial activity or in technology or innovations. But then again, if you really look at from this point of view, there was a very interesting thing that did happen was that you started seeing a large sets of entrepreneurial centers emerging, namely 5 of them. And you would actually see that a lot of formation of enterprises or new age enterprises are actually happening at 5 distinct locations. And those locations are the Delhi NCR, the National Capital Region, Mumbai, Bombay, Bangalore, Pune, and Hyderabad. But the most important of these places was the Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Chennai belt. That is where a lot of activity started happening around technology. And why was it actually happening? It also has its seeds in the past itself. It was in the 1980s that a lot of people started getting obsessed with engineering per se. That is when the privatization of schools actually did happen, and a lot of private engineering schools started emerging. As of today, India produces close to about 1.5 million engineers, 1.1 million engineers each year. But then it was in these 3 locations or this belt of Hyderabad, Chennai, and Bangalore, close to about 750,000 engineers were coming through. So this whole setup created this technology-oriented youth who were very smart, very talented, full of energy, and they wanted to change. They were also looking at how things were happening outside, and they came up. And there's an important factor also post the 90s, and that was about how information flows started happening. Because earlier, if you were really looking at it, something that was happening out in the US would take about a few years for us to really know as to what is the progress there. But post 90s or late 90s, the information flows became seamless. What happens in the US today happens in India today or across the world in a similar fashion, or at least you're able to have the same set of information. So those information asymmetries that existed, they started getting reduced over a period of time. And then, of course, there was also a very important thing from a social, cultural point of view that was happening in these locations. And it was about, so one was, of course, the talent that was actually available. The second thing was the tolerance that actually emerged out of these locations, because these were the locations which were very open to new sets of ideas. It was becoming very cosmopolitan. People could actually look at different sets of views. You were actually seeing a lot of people coming in together. You were actually having a convergence of arts with with science and so on and so forth. So that is what created that whole thing. And so it was about that technology, tolerance, and talent, that whole trinity in terms of like how Richard Florida would actually put it, that was seemingly there in action at that point in time. And now while we come to this time that we are sitting in 2021, it has been one of the most significant years in terms of like how entrepreneurship has actually emerged. Today, India is the third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world. And how do you really come to this figure of third largest entrepreneurial ecosystem? Like there is this very interesting study by Credit Suisse, which actually maps as to what is the level of investment that happens in enterprises. So US actually saw $143 billion of investments in 2021, 2021 within the entrepreneurial space. And then if you really look at China, it was 83 billion, and India has seen about 11.8 billion in the last few months. And then, of course, if you really look at something very interesting, to really look at the numbers here, in 2021, China has had 16 unicorns. And unicorn became a very big buzzword, like, oh, if I have a valuation of $1 billion, and that was actually being pegged as some very interesting thing happening. So China saw emergence of 16 in 2021. India saw rise of 15 this year. So we are just sitting in 4 months or 5 months of this year, and we've already seen 15 this year. And then Israel saw 6, Japan saw 2, and Singapore saw 2. So what used to be the hub of entrepreneurial activity at one point in time, like say Hong Kong, Singapore, or whatever, suddenly India's emergence has also happened in that space. And what it leads us to really see is that what is causing this in terms of like how things are changing and why this is changing. So one thing that we have to see is like there is something very significant that has happened in the last 18 months and across the world, and it is impacting all of us, and that is COVID. And the emergence of the very important thing in terms of like say how this is disrupted the various sets of industries, what impact it has actually had. But what we are seeing in India is something very interesting, like because there is this emergence of many, many interesting enterprises which are trying to understand the institutional gaps that actually exist in India right now. And those institutional gaps are getting filled by new age enterprises. They're trying to provide you solutions for the challenges that India actually faces. And there are new possibilities that are emerging because of this. But a couple of companies which I thought I should share about, like say one is a company called Zomato. Zomato is a very interesting firm which is going in for an IPO right now of about a $1.1 billion IPO happening in the next few months. But then, of course, their valuations are close to about $15 billion as of today. But quite interestingly, if you really look at it, they have their revenues for the year, financial year 2020 was close to about $30 million. And their revenues this year are close to about $20 million because, of course, the slowdown. But then what they've done is it's a delivery service. It's a food delivery service. With this huge lockdown happening, and there is this emergence of a food delivery service that happens. So they have created a repository of restaurants in a city. You have delivery partners who will actually pick up the food and get it to you. But very interesting idea, but then emerging very, very strongly. And now they're operating in 24 countries. The other one, which is very significant from my point of view, and one of the most important to be watched out for, is a company called Byju's. It was started by a young bloke, Ravindran Baiju, a few years back. And it was just a very simple platform wherein people were recording lessons and putting it up. It was like Khan Academy. But then there is this guy who comes in and says, oh, I'm going to assimilate everything that is there. But in 2020, after the pandemic, there is some huge emergence that we are actually seeing of Byju's per se. Today, they have a valuation of about $16.5 billion, and they have a revenue of close to about $1 billion. So there is this enterprise which has a revenue of $1 billion, and they have 80 million students who are actually working with them. So when you really talk about 80 million students, even though they might be paying a very minuscule amount to give you $1 billion in their revenue, but look at the possibilities that actually exist. But let's not forget that India is actually a resource, the per capita incomes are still low in India. So if you really look at as to how we have to look at India is like if you're able to bring a product at a low price and a quality product, it would just skyrocket. And that is what Byju's has actually done. Excuse me. And even in this space, if you really look at it, Byju's has actually been acquiring companies. In fact, Akash, which was Akash Tutorials, is an enterprise which was preparing people for entrance examinations. And there is this, they have just picked it up for close to about $1 billion recently. It was a brick and mortar store, training institution, and across different sets of cities, but gets picked up by them for $1 billion. But what this tells us is that there is a huge movement away from brick and mortar to technology-oriented businesses. And that is what we are actually seeing here. The other thing, like if you really look at one of the most important ones that actually did happen was Flipkart. And Flipkart is something which was picked up by Walmart in the last 3 years. But then if you really look at Flipkart is like very much like our Amazon, homegrown by young people. Today is valued at close to about 35 billion. And when you talk about Flipkart, so there is this very interesting thing that they have created in terms of like how they're able to create those partners. Very similar to Amazon, but nothing new around here. But that is what it is. And another enterprise which we find is quite interesting is a company called Urban Company. Again, like a lot of people will say, like, what is Urban Company? Urban Company is a set of services wherein if you actually need somebody to service your AC or somebody to serve or service your goods at home or whatever, that is what they would actually come here for and really help. So this was aggregation of talent with requirements at home. And this was also led by something very interesting. India was a very, if you really look at it, traditionally, India was operating at a store which was just around the corner for you. You would always have some kind of a mechanic or whatever. And this started changing, and they have actually been able to formalize this. So this has also had a huge impact in terms of like how India is actually moving. So there are many, many examples. Like another example which I find is a company called Cashify, started by my student. But Cashify is a thing wherein India was actually under this whole huge obsession of changing your mobile handset every 6 months, because there was this new technology coming in and people wanted to sell it. So Cashify just formalizes this process. You come and sell your product to Cashify, we'll buy it, we'll give you the money, and that's where it is. And it suddenly become a very interesting enterprise in terms of like how things have started around it. But having said that, what we need to really see today is that India has about 100 unicorns, which are valued at close to about $250 billion. And then, of course, within this pandemic, we have seen emergence or registration of 1,600 startups. And the total number, and I'm talking about technology startups here. And there are close to about 12,500 technology startups that actually exist within the country. But why is it that entrepreneurship is taking such a huge, mind space within the country as well? It is taking that mind space for a simple reason, and that it does create jobs, incomes, and things. And then, of course, the multiplier for this is absolutely huge. Without a doubt, it is as I see from an economic development point of view as well, it's only the large companies can only grow so much. So it is the entrepreneurial energy which will create the jobs and everything. And we're already seeing that. But what is it that changed in the last few years beyond this? So a couple of points which I feel are very important for what has happened in India is one is surge in private equity. Because these enterprise success was actually happening, you could see these valuations coming through. And people said, we can certainly look at investing. There is risk capital, but there is also multipliers that can actually happen. And so people started taking risk. But then, of course, these enterprises, which were getting created over a period of time, these were the young blokes, and they said, we have made our money, let us invest in something else as well. So there was this whole huge virtuous cycle that actually is getting created for investment. So now what we are seeing is we have an ecosystem which is becoming far more resilient for this, because the biggest barrier for not being able to create an enterprise was equity or money. So it was not there in India until now. And we are seeing a very robust private equity system that is actually happening. The second thing was, of course, very clearly talented people. And then what these companies or enterprises are doing, that from the initial days of replicating what was happening in the US or trying to just replicate ideas from across the world, what we are seeing is we are seeing emergence of enterprises which are targeting Indian problems. So India actually has very specific problems that need to be taken care of. So if you have challenges in education or education delivery, there is Byju's. And then why did education become important? Just a very interesting thing is in terms like for every year of education in India, and that's evidence from research that I'd recently done, for every year of education, it actually gives about 7% increase in your per capita incomes for our yearly incomes, if you're really talking about it. So you're solving for an Indian problem. So a lot of enterprises are doing that now. And but the question that gets the question that does arise is that what is it that why did India not actually have a very similar route to China in terms of emergence of its own social websites or something like Twitter of your own or something like a Google of your own or whatever. I think it became very easy for us to adopt to what Amazon was doing or what Google was doing or what Microsoft was doing because of there was hardly any language barrier that existed because India could actually use because English was the predominant language, so it became easier for us to adopt or adapt to these sets of technologies and people could just lap them in. So there was no requirement because of language that you have to create something on your own. So like in China, you've been able to create many interesting enterprises like Weibo and they have their own social networks and everything. But in India, that did not happen. But I think, but the other thing that did happen was internet. And this is the most important and significant change that has happened in India in the last few years. If you really look at the internet penetration today, it is huge. It is close to about 900 million people have access to internet through either sets of devices. Could be something like a very small feature phone to whatever. But the most important thing here is that 500 million people have smartphones in the country today. So when you talk about 500 million people having smartphones, then you would say, like, is it actually happening in just about the cities? No, it is cities as well as villages. 300 million people in cities have smartphones. And then 200 million people have smartphones in the villages. So there were two things that happened within this industry space. Like one was, of course, the entry barrier that existed for acquiring a smartphone that is in terms of like high cost of acquisition of a smartphone. It just got reduced. So there were these enterprises that were emerging, and that was also an entrepreneurial thing that was happening. So you had very huge sets of things that was happening in terms of like locally, local enterprises emerged to sell smartphones. So you were able to get a smartphone, or today you're able to get a smartphone for something like a $50, $60. You're able to get a smartphone which is able to run the Google's Android, and you're able to do anything and everything that you want to do. So you can actually do your Skype, you could do your Facebook, and everything was here. And you suddenly had this huge, opportunity that was actually projecting. The second thing that happened here, and I think that happened in the last 4 years, is the cost of access to internet. Today, India, what India sees is the cost of access to internet is just absolutely stunningly low. And this whole revolution, I would always say, was started by an enterprise called Jio. So Reliance came up with their own sets of services, but what they did was they simply changed the game by saying, we are going to give you access to internet at absolutely no price or at a very cheaper price. So they said voice is going to be free. We are not going to charge for voice. Everything is actually going to be charged for data. So today at about $10 a month, I'm able to get access to close to about 100 GB of data. So 100 GB of data for less than $10, and look at this large set of people. So Reliance today has close to about 350 million subscribers. And then, of course, everybody else had to follow suit for giving you cheaper data and things. Because this catapulted a lot of people to really move into accessing that information. But then now the question is, what is it that people are doing with 2 to 3 GB of data on a daily basis? Accessing information is the most critical thing. They are actually using to read, learn, whatever, to watch movies, OTT platforms. And then, of course, you'll have the naughty side of the internet, without a doubt. But the question is, everybody's doing it. So that access to information is huge. And that is where you're actually trying to do away with information asymmetries and things. So this is what did start happening here. There was also this very important thing that was done by the government, which we should give credit to, and that was something called as the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Trinity. Jan Dhan was giving access to banking to everybody. And there is this technology stack that was actually created. So they said everybody should have access to a banking account. Everybody should be able to bank on your mobile or whatever. And then you had this huge emergence of enterprises like Paytm. Paytm became, so today transacting on my phone, I can just do anything and everything using my phone. All my banking is actually happening on the mobile. So if you really look at like something like Zelle, if I'm not wrong, that's the name of the thing that people use in colleges today or in universities today to transfer money. And then you suddenly really having Paytm, Razorpay, and you're able to make very micro transactions. So India enabled that micro transaction space, which also changed how access to banking was happening, or how access to formal money was actually happening in that space. That gave rise to large sets of technology stack companies which were working on banking solutions and so on and so forth. Then, of course, if you really look at the other one was the identification code. That also made it easier because since there was a unique identity that was getting created and people were able to give loans to people. So suddenly you have emergence of enterprises like micro loan enterprises, wherein you're able to take something because you have an identification, you are able to really get mapped. This also solved a lot of problems. So like when you were really using these technological spaces, this was enabling a lot of new age enterprises to actually come up. But what we are seeing is that there is this large technology play that is actually happening. What we are seeing is that there is this, you're trying to solve problems using the technology for whatever you're seeing. So, but with COVID, I foresee that there are going to be some very interesting things that will actually happen. And that'll be in terms of saying, you will see a lot of, because of the problems that we are facing because of COVID and the challenges because of the pandemic, you will see emergence of enterprises who are actually going to come into healthcare. And we're already seeing that because today, because of pandemic, people are not able to go to hospitals, or you're not able to really, talk to doctors and so on and so forth. So there is this whole thing that is emerging, like telephonic doctor consultation that is really emerging. And that's going to be one of the big things that is going to happen. Education as a thing. And then, of course, I see that whole huge movement in terms of how everybody will start looking at across the board for education on the internet, something like what we are doing right now. And there would be a formalization that is expected to happen. And then, of course, if you really look at it, I think education is going to be one space which is going to get disrupted very, very hugely in India in terms of because you are suddenly able to give quality education, quality professors to a large sets of people. Initially, it was a problem of asset utilization. So if Richard is an asset in terms of, say, an expert, he was only able to talk to 20 people, 30 people, maybe 50 people. And if you had a room full of course, maybe 900 people in your auditorium. But then that was an underutilization of assets. Suddenly what you're seeing is that there is a great talent, there is a great professor. I can actually take him to large sets of people. And there is this whole huge asset utilization problem that has actually got solved. And wherever we are able to do that, that is what is emerging within India that we are seeing. And if you really look at it, I think there are a couple of things that I would like to share in terms of like, what is my experience of investing in enterprises. So I have invested in 6 enterprises on my own. I got my retirement benefits from one of the exits that I've made. I've only made one exit until now. But then there was a very interesting company called Metal. Metal was an enterprise which I seed funded for 2 young boys from college. Nobody was wanting to fund them at that point in time. So Tanmay was the name of the young bloke from IIT IIM, and his sister used to work as an RA with me, and then we just met, and he said, "I want to start this enterprise, and there is nothing that is available. We don't have the thing." I said, "What is it?" I said, "Okay, I'll invest some money," and that is how my first investment actually happened. And I took the biggest risk of my life at that point in time because whatever money I had in my bank, I just gave him 90% of the money that I had. And I said, and if somebody asks me, what was the method of really doing it? Like, was it a business idea or was it? I said, no, it was never about a business idea that I invested in that enterprise. It was because of the people that I invested in that enterprise. It is always about people. And then, of course, it was a great decision in hindsight. And then we exited at about 100x the value in about 7-8 years. So that was something, and that gave me confidence to really moving further. And when you really talk about Metal is an enterprise which works in assessment of students. So it was technology play in terms of like how students, so it was about how you can actually assess the capability of students and things. And that is what they were actually doing. And then once I exited that, I said, oh, I need to do something more and really look at some other ideas. So like everybody's obsession, like I also had this obsession of having a media enterprise into the portfolio. Because media is the naughtiest of them all. Like it gives you that false sense of pride and false sense of it gives you that arrogant thing. Oh, if I am an owner of a media company, I would control the world. And it was my biggest, and it has not been successful. So because it happened under that arrogance and thinking, oh yes, let me invest there. It's a great company. We have the largest magazine in the country, but not profitable. So if you really look at it, the magazine is there because media, I understood that media is a very difficult business to be in. It is not something which is easy because the media revenue models are so skewed. Because today, if you really look at it, people are not wanting to pay for content. And that's the kind of thing that's happening within India. It is now that we are seeing some uptick in terms of payments of some content or payment for reading of content. And then the whole model was based on what you would call as advertising. So there was this whole use thing. And there's always this debate that happens in India in terms of the media. Is there enough independence if you are really, getting paid for by enterprises? I think the independence does exist. You are always able to create that, but it is not about how do you scale it and things. And there is also a very interesting thing. Media has its own problem. It's not a very global business. Media will always become a very localized business, how it operates. To really make it a global business as well, like say Economist for that matter, which is the world's most respected magazine from my point of view. I read it every week. But it does not have more than 20 million subscribers. So at a world level, it's a fairly small, in a world which has 7 billion people, 20 million subscribers is nothing. And then suddenly you have Byju's, which is about education, has 80 million subscribers in less than 3 years or 4 years. And then, of course, my experience of investing in the other sets of companies, like I would like to name 2 of them. And then I heard this very interesting thing called artificial intelligence about a few years back. And I said, no, this sounds interesting, but I don't understand a zilch about it. I don't understand it even today, I must confess. But I invested in 2 startups which were talking about artificial intelligence. And again, like it was Devtron and Confinity. And we invested in it. But today we are all, again, now it is getting funded. It's getting into its, again, I seed funded this enterprise. And I said, okay, I like the people. I like these young blokes. I did not understand the business model at all, but then I like these people. I think they have this passion of doing something interesting and different. And that's what I did. So they are going in for their round of funding at $100 million in the next few months. So there is this very interesting thing that is happening. So if you ask me, I just thought through, there are 4 things that I actually look at when I was looking at investing. One was always about the team, the passion that you have. The third was the sense of purpose. And if they were idiotic enough to think that they can change the world, if they had it in them that, yes, I will be able to change the world, then I think they are sets of people. They are the crackpots that I would like to invest in, because entrepreneurs who think they can change the world are the set of people eventually who will do something different and very, very scalable over a period of time. So that is what I've actually done in terms of investments. But if you really look at what are the disruptions for the future, as I said, banking, insurance, sports, education is very, very clearly that is going to happen. But there are a few learnings which I thought I should share with you in terms of like, Well, what is it that defines entrepreneurship in India? One is very clearly scale. Today, we have understood, like if you're able to scale up, if you're able to take your services to 1 billion people, there is a huge opportunity that exists. Initially, what used to happen was that I would need to make a large set of extraction from small number of people. Or when I say like value creation for whatever small number of people, I'll make my money or whatever. But today, what you're seeing is, even if I'm able to look at uh, a rupee from a person, that is what is, and over a year, that is going to change something. In fact, like one of my most interesting insights that I've ever had on entrepreneurship was from a person none other than Mr. Mukesh Ambani. He is the owner of Reliance. He's a second generation entrepreneur. Reliance was started by his dad. But like there is this very interesting mindset that I see when he talks about things. And he says that, can I sell something? Can I do something for 1 billion people? If I'm able to do something for 1 billion people, then it makes sense to be in that business. And then it is not about that I have to exploit those billion people or whatever. It is about like, what is it that I'm able to do from revenues with those billion people? That is exactly what they did with the telecom services as well. $10, give 100 GB of data, but 350 million people on the stack. So look at the kind of revenues that you're really talking about. They made an investment of $10 billion in that business, but they will become profitable very, very quickly. They became operationally profitable in no time because they were able to look at that scale. So that is what we are seeing in India. So it is about scale that you're able to have. Business models which are scalable is going to be changing, is going to be the driver. The second thing was there were a lot of things that were changing from a operational point of view as to how the landscape was changing, like the regulations were changing, they were becoming helpful. Fundamentals were there, like you had the talent that existed, and there was this whole huge virtuous cycle that got created of innovation and capital within the country. And then, but the biggest question that I do ask, and I don't have an answer to, and that is about like what is driving these valuations. Like I find valuations to be obnoxious at points in time. Of course, I've been privy to some of the benefits of those valuations. I'll not deny that fact. I love it that until that time. But as an academic, I have to ask a question like, what is driving these valuations and things? So maybe it is more into the future, like because there could be some very good, hardcore, what do you call, enterprises which have done wonders in the past. They are not being valued to the extent for what they do. It's like a Tesla problem, like the Tesla versus the Ford problem. Ford gets valued less than Tesla, and Tesla still just has about 3 models, and which kill people on the streets. At least there was some recent thing that actually did happen on an accident. Like, so what I'm saying is like technology is still not. It's not about Tesla. It's about the technology is still very weak in terms it's not able to gauge what is happening, and so there are some accidents. But I think these technologies will move or change. But then what is happening is like it's more about the scale, as I see it, like people who are able to use technology and change. So because everything is about that ecosystem that is emerging. Last 2 things, like one is of course asset utilization, as I said, that is one of the key things. And then of course we should not forget that enterprises are something which are about they add value to the sellers, but then it also improves buyers' productivity. If I'm able to sell something which is improving buyers' productivity, that is simply getting the kind of traction that we are really talking about, and that is what is making enterprises successful. So this is where I am. Sorry, Richard, I took more time than I had promised. But thanks a lot.
Well, Amit, thank you very much for your remarks. You started out with a historical overview of how the rise of entrepreneurship kind of tracked the rise of Indian economic development and stages in the Indian economy's development. Talked about the kind of level where it is now, that India is really the 3rd largest entrepreneurial center in the world. Especially if you look at venture capital investments, America is number 1 with 143 billion last year, and China number 2, and India kind of distant, but number 3, larger than anywhere else, with India having 15 unicorns, last year, created last year, while China had 16 created last year. And then talking about some of the exciting new companies and talking about kind of these points that you see in the patterns of entrepreneurship. One thing that I kind of want to come back is how entrepreneurship is affecting the system of the whole economy. Because a lot of what you're talking about is rapid growth out of a factor-driven economy, an economy where natural resources and cheap human labor were the sources of economic growth for a long time. And gradually, innovation seems to have taken over a lot of the heavy lifting in regard to economic growth. Usually, in a lot of economies, you see this middle phase from factor-driven growth. Between that and innovation-driven growth, you usually see something called efficiency-driven growth, where there will be a large developed industrial base in an economy, a bunch of large companies, big companies, and essentially they become prestigious. People tend to want to go to work for these companies. They want their children to go to work for these companies. And in some kind of may inhibit innovation. We've kind of seen this in South Korea and in Japan, and very possibly, I think this could happen in China with the growth of the giant IT firms like Ant Group or whatever. What about the role of the very large India groups, Tata Group and the Reliance Group and Wipro and its related companies? What's their, how do they fit into this picture now?
So that's a very interesting question, Richard. If you really look at it, I think when you talk about the Tatas or when you talk about Reliance or whatever, if I talk about the Tatas are a great enterprise, without a doubt. I think one of the most important enterprises that India has actually seen. And I think they're great for multiple reasons. Like one is, I think the biggest point of appreciation for them is the work ethic that they actually imbibe. But having said that, if you really look at Tatas, Tatas are in more traditional businesses. And that is where they're actually operating. So Tatas operate in traditional businesses. And when I'm talking about, say, outsourcing is a traditional business. Because today, outsourcing is a 30-year-old story. They have their own TCS or Tata Consulting Services. They do that work. Great area to work in. But it was about, that model was about labor arbitrage, not anything else. So it was very deeply embedded in the factor-driven idea of the economy. That is where they're stacking up. They've also had some very interesting things like Tanishq, wherein that's a jewelry business that they actually have. They have been able to formalize that business. But again, it was more about creating a storefront and whatever. They've not been able to really do something like what a Gucci will do or whatever, because that's where India right now is. Because in the evolutionary acceptance of what we want as people, we're not willing to pay for brands. We're willing to pay for jewelry, some making charges or whatever. So that is where they are right now. But the new age companies, I think because they're nimble, because they're able to be very quick, they're able to move faster. So they have their own space in traditional businesses. I think it will be very, very difficult for anyone to come there and throw them out. When you talk about steel manufacturing, or when you talk about to create a steel manufacturing unit requires a lot of investment. And then, of course, it also requires, it does employ a large number of people, but it also has its thing in terms like how challenging it can actually be over a larger period of time, because I'm not able to scale up very quickly. But today, what we are really seeing is because of technology, I'm able to see scale ups which are very, very fast. So today, if I create an enterprise, and if it is a technology play, I'm able to go from 0 to 1 billion people in possibly 2 to 3 years. I will never be able to do that in enterprises which are going to be, say, hardcore manufacturing enterprises or whatever. It takes a long time to really get there. So I think the requirement or the requisite or the competencies that are required for those businesses are so different that they're actually getting into new age enterprises. And then if you really look at it, I think it's also about the new age, the set of people, how youngsters look at things. I think the very eyes with which we would look at things and to a 20-year-old person will look at it is different. I have my own whole inertia that possibly exists because there is this traditional way of looking at it. So, like it's like this. When I got into academics about 20 years back or whatever, I always used to think, what are these oldie professors doing? And I always used to think them as a bunch of morons who do not have an idea as to how the world is changing. And now there are younger professors who possibly think that I'm a moron who does not know how the world is changing. So this is what it is like. So it's the next generation which will happen. So we need to not forget that the God principle of business. I always say that the God principle: generate, operate, and destroy. So that or disruption will always happen. So we will get disrupted, and the enterprises will get disrupted. Richard.
Thank you. So I also want to ask, kind of in that regard, about the sources of funding for startup companies in India. It seems to me that until recently, most of the available funding for startups was really foreign money, not domestic India money. But that in recent years, you've really seen a dramatic rise of more domestic kind of focused or domestically based funding mechanisms. Would you agree with that or not?
So it's not a straightforward answer, Richard. So there are two sets of scales at which funding is possibly happening. So if you're really looking at seed funding or until about when you talk about $10 million things, so seed funding to about the rounds until about $10 million, whatever you're there to talk about, it's being done by a lot of local people.
Okay.
So that is where we are seeing a lot of activity that does actually happen. You have a lot of seed investors that are actually there who would like to invest in ideas. You have people who have come together to create a venture fund wherein they'll want to fund enterprises until about $10 million. But even today, if you really look at it, when you're talking about rounds which are about 100 million and over, it is still about international money because that's where they have that capability to take risk. So you have enterprises from, say, Israel or Japan or China. So there are those people who are actually coming in. So you would always see that kind of situation. But then what we are seeing is that initially to even get seed funding was impossible for people. So my story, it's something very interesting. For me, being an academic is an accident. I still remember, and when I say it's an accident, for a simple reason, in 1998, I wanted to start something like an online store. So it was like an online store that I wanted to sell things on the internet. And I did not have the money. In fact, I asked my father, I said, like, Dad, would it be possible for you to give me at that point in time $10,000 to start the business? And I was about on my way to I was just finishing my PhD, and he said, "Oh, I don't have the money. I can't. There's no spare money." And I could empathize with him because at that point in time, the money making ability was very less, and so never happened. So at that time, I was not able to create $10,000 to start something like an online store. But there was another person sitting in Washington who created that online store called Amazon, and suddenly ends up becoming something like a $170 billion enterprise or valuation for himself. So the only difference is that one became a billionaire. I'm still a professor, but that's okay. I'm enjoying and I'm critiquing him. But that's the part of the story.
Well, there are those of us who are old enough to remember online delivery of food being something that looked great. And there was a company called Webvan around 1998 that became public and lots of people invested in and lost money because it failed, because it expanded too fast. So you're right about your point about scaling being absolutely critical is a really important point. I'll ask maybe one more question, and this really comes from the audience, and I'd like to encourage people in the audience to ask questions. But a lot of most of the startup companies that you're talking about seem to be very problem driven. They see a gap in services, or they see a gap in products, or they see a need in the community, and they come up with the most reasonable technology solution to solve that gap in a way. But you're not really seeing, or you haven't mentioned, what I would call really breakthrough technology companies that are trying to do things on, an advanced technology scale. Now, granted, in my experience, investment money likes to keep the risk as low as possible, and so it will invest in things that are clearly solving problems. But I'm curious, why do you think India hasn't really generated something like the next Google?
So that's a great question. I always try to grapple with that question myself, that when India produces 1 million engineers every year, and we are not able to create our own Google. The Skype gets created out of a university in Tallinn, in Estonia, and it's 2 PhD students or whatever. I think there were multiple things. Like, one is that the risk-reward ratio that seems to be existent to really create a technology play did not exist in India at that point in time. I think the power to sustain that level of risk, even today in India, is very, very low. But we also have to accept one thing. I think when you talk about places like the Silicon Valley or whatever, there was a huge level of governmental support as well, or you have an ecosystem which is very, very strong. I think it's also about the ideas that they are able to get created. In your ecosystem in Bay Area, as I see, you have a number of great places where that churn of ideas actually happens. So you have Berkeley, you have Stanford, and whatever. So this churn of ideas is just exceptional. We have not seen that churn of ideas for moving into newer technology spaces and enough risk capital being available and things. In fact, if you really look at the R&D money, I think it's also a function of R&D investments that actually happen. India spends very minimal, in comparison to the world, we don't spend much. But whatever R&D spends that actually happen, we spend close to about 2% of our GDP on science and technology and R&D things. Israel spends close to about 6%. So if on a scale of India, it does not really make a lot of money. But then the question here is that most of it is actually being done by the government. 70% of R&D spends in India actually happens to government. So the private investment in R&D is not there. So if you really look at it, we are seeing some change here. If you really look at this whole COVID thing or the pandemic thing, it has also given a rise to the Indian vaccine. So we've actually had, and it is now getting approved in the US. In fact, I was just reading the newspaper, just getting into the session, that the homegrown Indian vaccine will possibly get approval to be used in the US. So if you really look, and because it is able to take care of 617 strains of viruses or corona family of viruses. So there is that space that is happening. But again, it actually happened because government funded that work. So that basic research, that huge thing that the government does, how universities play, how that experimentation happens, possibly that's a missing element. And hopefully we will get there. We have got into that basic services, but on technology front, we are still about, I think, 5 to 10 years away. So maybe at some point in time, we might see some disruption that might happen. But then, would it be in the operating space or somewhere else? That is a question to ask. But we are also, I must say, Richard, but there is something very important that is happening here. Wherever we are, there is an emergence of large sets of solutions on software as a service that is happening in India right now. So like when you talk about, we are using Zoom right now. Of course, Zoom happened out of California, but then you have similar sets of businesses which are emerging out of India now as software as a service and those subscription models. So we are seeing that happen, and we expect that it is actually going to pick up over a period of time. I think we are also doing away with the obsession of replicating everything from the West. The typical obsession in India was always about replicating any solution that has happened in the West, and we create an enterprise here. Now we are really saying, let's solve the local problems. Let's understand the institutional voids that exist, and let's go into that space.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to Dr. Prakash Habalkar for that question. Have one more question that came from the audience. If people have questions, please write your name in the chat window so that I can make sure to see you. There's a couple of pages of people in this gallery view, and so I won't know that you're asking the question unless you do something like that. So please just type your name in the chat window if you would. Regionally, it seems like Delhi and Bengaluru are really the centers of entrepreneurship. And I'm curious, what about other major urban centers? How are they developing? Are they behind? If they're behind, why are they behind?
So, Richard, I think if you really ask me, like there are about 5 or 6 centers, as I had said, which are driving a lot of entrepreneurial activity in India. So the Delhi, the National Capital Region of Delhi, so that is Gurgaon, Delhi, Noida area. Then Bombay is there, Pune is there, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Chennai. This is where a lot of entrepreneurial activity is actually happening. And it is possibly happening for a simple reason that you have much more robust systems that have actually got into play out here. It is also in terms of like, this is where people with money live. If you really look at it, where would you want to go? Like, where is it easy to really interact with people who are already doing these kind of things, or the ecosystem exists? I'm able to get investment. So it is a lot easier to actually end up meeting people who are either entrepreneurs or meet investors or whatever. So the ecosystem I've got created here. We see, as of today, I really don't see a lot of entrepreneurial activity in tech space out of these locations. You have had some examples from places like Chandigarh, but they have not really been able to sustain at that locations. But what we are also seeing is, but again, I'm just talking about technology space. But when you talk about small cities or the other tier 2 cities in India, we are seeing emergence of some very local enterprises who are creating solutions for local areas. So they might not be scalable to billion-dollar enterprises or whatever, but they are there in terms of solving some very basic local problems. So there are enterprises who are into, say, taking care of trash. But then trash is not scalable business. So you're seeing emergence of some enterprises who are managing trash at the local level, and they have created business models around it. There is an enterprise called Janajal, again, like which is about, because water is a huge problem in India. So they are actually a business which is about filtered water or clean water, which is made to be, which can be made available. So they have started doing things, creating water spots at railway stations. So there are those people. So these are very investment heavy businesses as well, and which take a lot of time. So that is what we are seeing. But from smaller towns that they're emerging and things. But from a technology space point of view, I really don't see emergence of any location in the foreseeable future, because most of the things will happen here in these cities because of the ecosystem that exists. It's something like similar to the US. When you talk about US, like you have Silicon Valley, you have something like the New York, Boston area, you have something in the Phoenix area or whatever. And that's where a lot of technology things happen. So for some reason, they all get attracted to those locations and then start operating.
Okay, thank you. Thanks also to Dr. Habalkar for that question. Please let me know if you have a question, anybody in the audience. In the meantime, my next question for you, Amit, is about the slowdown of the national economy in China and the rise of US-China kind of friction. How has that affected the situation in India, either for international activities by startup companies or international investments in startup companies in India? Do you see much any kind of a connection there, or is it really primarily domestic things in India that are driving the system forward?
I think so. This is, if you really ask me this question, like the friction between, say, China and US or whatever, I think this whole huge movement towards moving away supply chains from China or enterprises actually wanting to reduce risk. It was an opportunity that it did exist for a certain point in time. But what has happened is that there was huge competition in this space. Like you had Vietnam, you had Thailand, you had Malaysia, and whatever. So there have things that have moved there as well. But in terms of, say, enterprise creation or in terms of entrepreneurship, I really don't see any major shift that has actually happened in India. And then, of course, given the pandemic, India has far more challenging situations to really solve right now in India, which is really taking a lot of mind space and space for a lot of people. This pandemic has been brutal for India, as you would know. Like, so it's taking a lot of mind space. And I think we might actually look at those sets of things as a country, as possibilities or whatever, possibly about 24 months from now, when things really start getting normalized.
So, Amit, I do, today we really should not let the session end without me asking a little bit about what's it like on the ground in Delhi with the COVID situation now.
So, like Richard, this is a very difficult question and a very painful question, I must say. This has been the worst time that we are seeing as a country. I've never seen something like this. In fact, I could have never imagined something like this. So if you really look at it, like it's like a hell kind of a situation. So if you really picture hell or whatever, if you look at movies, this is what we are really seeing, like people dying in so many numbers. It is very, very painful. I don't know of any family today in my area, in my present circle, who's not really got affected by COVID. Either they're infected, they've had a death in a family, or whatever. In fact, if you really look at the official numbers on COVID deaths is close to about 250,000, but the unofficial thing is that we could have already touched about 2.5 million. So if you really look at the number of people dead because of this disease and the pandemic, it is just very, very painful. But I just hope that we have the resilience to get out of it, because the present wave is something which nobody expected. It's like death has come and captured us with stealth, as I would say, and this is where it is. But hopefully we will be resilient enough to get out of it in the next few weeks.
Thank you. I think all of us hope that, and all of us are committed to trying to do whatever we can, no matter where we are, in regard to helping the situation improve resources. And there's a lot of things out there on the internet about how people can get involved. Amit, where do you think India is going in regard to sort of the role of entrepreneurship in the economy? Will it continue to be, will it have a breakthrough technology venture at some point in the relatively near future?
So, Richard, again, a very important question. I think when you ask me as a question like where is entrepreneurship going, I think it is going to be the most important stack for India in the future. If you really look at the unicorns today, in fact, as we were just looking, if you look at numbers, the unicorns contribute close to about 1.2% or 1.3% of India's GDP right now.
Wow.
But it is expected that they will go to close to about 5% of the GDP in the coming 5 years. So the economic impact of entrepreneurship is going to be phenomenal in India. What I see is that if you really look at the future set of growth in India, it is actually going to happen through new age enterprises that actually get created. It's not going to be about traditional businesses. Like you will have your car companies, you'll have your steel companies, they will be there. But the wealth creation for the future is actually going to happen through new age enterprises. But to your second part of the question, will there be a technology breakthrough company happening here? I think when you talk about technology breakthrough, in terms of, say, computing and everything, I don't see that happening. But if you ask me in terms of medical care or something like a biotechnology thing, or if you really ask me to really create a vaccine or whatever, I see that happening in India because of the system that actually exists. And I've seen that system operating in India. Like if we were talking about 30 years back or 40 years back, we might not have seen that India also was able to create a vaccine for COVID-19. But India has been able to create that vaccine. Of course, we have not been able to scale it up for many reasons or whatever. But I think we were able to create that. So that means the science part of India is there. It is resilient enough. If people are willing to work on it, it will happen. So I see that in biotech space, I see a lot of things happen because that's where a lot of focus will happen. But in terms of, like, say, something like breakthrough technology in terms of computing or whatever, I don't think so. It is happening anytime soon out here.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, why don't we call an end to the formal session? And thank you so much, Amit, for a great overview and explanation of the situation in India.
Thank you. Such a pleasure. Thank you.